very happy to be here to speak at this prestigious room. When I was president of the Asian Development Bank, I visited Kathmandu twice to discuss about ADB projects in Nepal with Nepali government officials. But this time, as a professor, I'm relatively free, and as Dr. Bindu Rohani said, I am really enjoying staying in Kathmandu, and I would like to speak about Asian economic development, past and future, for about 45 minutes or 1 hour, and then I can accept any questions related to Asian economic development, but also even about global economy, financial conditions in the world, fiscal and monetary policy in Japan or US, Europe or China, and so on and so forth. But first, I would like to speak about Asian economic development, past and future. I think Asian economies and Japan established a close relationship with each other, particularly after the Korean War. Initially, Japan was the center or growth center of Asian economies, and East Asian economies achieved rapid economic development with trading with Japan. The Japanese economy started to slow down in the 1970s, but then Japan's direct investment to East Asian economies soared in the 1980s, contributing to rapid growth in those economies. But since 1990s, East Asian economies continue to grow somewhat independently from the Japanese economy, because the Japanese economy became stagnant after the bursting of the bubble in early 1990s. So I would focus on Asian economic development, particularly in the last 30 years, that is to say 1920s, 2000, 2010s, and 2020s, and discuss about the challenges they are going to face in the next 30 years. Before going into the Asian economic development in the last 30 years, perhaps I should mention a little bit about Japan's economic growth, economic development before 1990s. Japan's high-speed growth in the 1960s, actually late 1950s to 1970, it was really spectacular. Its GDP growth rate was about 10% on average. This growth was brought about by more than 10% annual increase of labor productivity in the manufacturing sector. And exports increased tremendously. Export volume annually increased more than 5% each year during that period. In particular, iron and steel, ships, machineries export increased tremendously. Major export market was, at that time, was the United States, and major import sources were East Asia, thus spreading economic growth first to so-called NEES, newly industrialized economies like South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore, and then to ASEAN, ASEAN 10 countries, including Malaysia, Thailand, Philippines, Indonesia, and so on and so forth. This happy situation changed from 1971 when President Nixon announced to abolish gold convertibility of the dollar on 15 August 1971, ending the so-called Bretton Woods system or global fixed exchange rate system. And immediately after the Nixon shock, the yen appreciated from 360 yen to the dollar to 300 yen to the dollar, about 20% appreciation of the yen against the dollar. And Japan's economic growth decelerated toward 4.5% in the first half of 1970s, and that slowdown economic growth continued in the late 70s. However, as I said, East Asian economies continued to grow by 8 to 10% in 1970 to 79. After the oil crisis in 1973 and 1979, Japan experienced double-digit inflation, but contained it by 1980. However, the US continued to suffer from inflation in early 1980s, with the dollar appreciating due to short-term interest rate above 20%. Afraid of US protectionism, Japan and Germany agreed to appreciate their currencies by selling the dollar and purchasing their respective currencies. That was the Plaza Accord of G5 on 22 September 1985. The yen appreciated toward 200 yen to the dollar from 300 yen. And the dollar continued to depreciate so that G7 countries agreed to maintain exchange rates around the current levels on 22 February 1987. This is the so-called ruble agreement. But that did not stop continued depreciation of the dollar. So dollar depreciated around 130 yen to the dollar by the late 1980s. So during the 1980s, Japanese companies made huge direct investment in East Asia and shift some manufacturing production there, helping East Asian economies to grow by 6 to 8% in the 1980s. Also because of substantial fiscal and monetary easing, Japanese economy grew by close to 5% in the late 1980s, but created huge asset bubble which collapsed in the early 1990s. So from now on, I would focus on the Asian economic development in the last 30 years. As I said, the Japanese asset bubble burst in the early 90s. Since then, Japan's average growth rate decelerated significantly and stayed around only about 1 to 1.5% growth thereafter, meaning 1990s, 2000 and 2010. So I distributed a chart, graph showing the per capita GDPs of Asian countries. Please look at this chart. The uppermost line shows Japan's per capita GDP, which has fluctuated widely in the last 30 years. But as I said, average growth was only about 1 to 1.5%. So large fluctuations reflect large dollar-yen exchange rate fluctuation. When dollar appreciate, per capita GDP in US dollars would go up sharply. When yen depreciate against the dollar, then it would go down quite sharply. So huge fluctuations show huge fluctuation of the yen-dollar rate in the last 30 years. But anyway, Japan's per capita GDP somewhat stagnated in the last 30 years. Now, the most amazing growth per capita occurred in South Korea and Taiwan. The purple line and double line shows South Korean per capita GDP and Taiwanese per capita GDP. As you can see, in early 90s, or actually in 1990, per capita GDP in Japan was $25,900, while in South Korea, per capita GDP was only 6,600, Taiwan only 8,100. So basically, 30 years ago, South Korean and Taiwanese per capita GDP was only about 1/3 of Japan's per capita GDP. But the chart shows quite rapid growth of per capita GDP in South Korea and Taiwan. Now, in 2022, per capita GDPs in Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan are almost exactly the same, around 34,000 US dollars. And since the South Korean economy as well as the Taiwanese economy are likely to grow by at least around 2.5% in the next 5-10 years, that means that per capita GDP in South Korea and Taiwan would surpass Japan's per capita GDP from this year or next year onward. I think the South Korean and Taiwanese rapid economic growth, rapid economic development is not well known in Asia or in the world. I think it's a pity because with limited resources, natural resources limited in those countries, they developed very efficient, competitive manufacturing sector, initially from heavy industries to IT sector and also IT service sector. And nowadays, Korean and Taiwanese semiconductor sector is the most competitive ones in the world, and their economy continue to grow. The next group is inclusive of Malaysia and China. Dotted line shows Malaysian per capita GDP, and the red line shows Chinese per capita GDP. Both of them showed significant growth, reaching per capita GDP around 13,000 US dollars. You may know that between per capita GDP of around 2,000 and 13,000, those countries are called middle-income countries. But now, China and Malaysia overcame so-called middle-income trap, becoming high-income countries, meaning developed countries. No more developing countries, China and Malaysia. The third is gray line with a triangle shows per capita GDP of Thailand. Thailand is a somewhat unhappy case because its per capita GDP grew slowly compared with other East Asian economies. And particularly after the so-called East Asian currency crisis erupted in 1997. Of course, Asian currency crisis also affected the Korean economy significantly, but the Korean economy quickly overcame currency crisis and even did speed up economic growth. On the other hand, Thai economic growth slowed down permanently, so that before the Asian currency crisis, Thai economy was a rising star in Southeast Asia. But since then, the Thai economy continued to underperform compared with other East Asia or Southeast Asian economies. But of course, its per capita GDP is around $7,600, so-called middle-income country. The next group include multiple countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, and the Philippines. These are fairly big economies. Indonesia has a population of more than 250 million. Vietnam and the Philippines both about 100 million population. So they are quite big economies. And now their per capita income is around 4,000 to 5,000. So they are still really middle of the middle income group. But their medium-term growth potential appears to be 5 to 6%, much higher than the Thai economic growth, and also higher than South Korean or Taiwanese economic growth. That means that these three countries with high growth in coming decades will gradually catch up at least Thai economy. And the gap between these economies and fast-growing economies like Malaysia, China may narrow down in coming decades. The last line shows the India's per capita GDP, which is still around 2,400 US dollars. but its potential growth rate is quite high, as you know. IMF economists argued that probably the Indian potential growth rate would be 7 to 8% in the next few decades. That means that India may become the next growth center of Asia, as well as the world, following China. I didn't put Nepali per capita GDP here, but I understand the current per capita GDP in Nepal is something like 1,300 US dollars. So that Nepal is still in the low-income country group, but as I argue later, Nepal has huge potential to make significant economic development and growth in coming decades. So I hope particularly young people in Nepal be ambitious to make the Nepali economy grow strongly and sustainably. Now, these are the last 30 years of Asian economies. From now on, I would like to speak about challenges to be faced by Asian economies in the next 30 years. Of course, such a long-term prediction is subject to great uncertainty. So this is my assessment at this moment, and young people in Nepal may experience various challenges as well as swift economic development, and they would have to focus on challenges faced by the Nepali economy in the next 30 years. So I should mention at least something like 4 major challenges faced by the Asian economies. Of course, there may be more challenges, new challenges coming in the next 30 years, but at this moment, I can see at least 4 major challenges to be faced by Asian economies. The first is maybe, hopefully, a medium-term challenge. That is what we call fragmentation of the world economy. After the Ukraine war, after Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, February last year, the world economy has been clearly fragmented. Of course, fragmentation started well before Ukraine war in February 2022. Actually, Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014, acquiring a significant part of Ukraine territory. And also, China has strengthened military actions in East China Sea and South China Sea from early 2010s. And relationship between US and China has worsened significantly in the last 5-6 years. But clearly, the war in Ukraine made fragmentation of the world economy, fragmentation in global economies quite clear and distinct. For, of course, Asian economies, Russia is not so important. For the European economy, Russia is so important because Europe had been dependent on fossil fuel import from Russia, coal, oil, and natural gas. And also, European countries exported automobiles, IT goods, and other expensive goods to Russia. But this mutual and very intensive trade has completely collapsed. In Asia, of course, this Russian economic impact is relatively limited, except for high energy prices in the last year. For Asian economies, the Chinese economic situation is the most relevant and important factor. Because Asian economies are so much dependent on their trade with China. For most of Asian economies, the largest export market is China. And for all of them, the largest import source is China. This is true even for Japan, South Korea, Australia. The largest export market is China. Largest import source is China. And so many East Asian economies, as well as South Asian economies, like India. For India, the largest export market is already China, and the largest import source is already China. So all Asian economies, East Asian economies, Southeast Asian economies, South Asian economies, also Central Asian economies, China is so important. And so the Chinese aggression in East Asia, Southeast Asia created problems with Japan and Southeast Asian economies. So if this kind of geopolitical tension in East Asia will continue, then of course, on the one hand, Chinese economy would be affected, but on the other hand, almost all Asian economies could suffer from somewhat slower growth because of reduced economic relationship with China. China is so dominant in the Asian economies. And of course, for Nepal, China is not so important. Something like 3/4 of Nepali exports go to India, and something like 2/3 of imports come from India. So, and also I understand 4 or 5 million Nepali people are working in India. So for Nepal, India is by far the most important, dominant trading and economic partner. And the geopolitical tension in East Asia, Southeast Asia may not affect the Nepali economy so much. But at least almost all Asian economies could suffer from this rising East Asian, Southeast Asian geopolitical tensions. And this is not economic factor. This is military security matter, and so difficult to predict. But this kind of East Asian geopolitical tension, Southeast Asian geopolitical tension may continue for some time. So this could be the first challenge faced by Asian economies. Second challenge faced by Asian economies, most of Asian economies, is shrinking and aging population. Of course, shrinking and aging population are most notable in Japan, also Korea and Taiwan. Also China. I understand Chinese working age population has been declining, but according to the latest statistics, total population may have started to decline in China. As I said, Japanese population, Korean population, Taiwanese population, they are declining for some time. And so that the average age of their population is well over 40 years old. And Chinese average age is close to 40 years old. So all East Asian economies, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, China, their population is shrinking, and average age is becoming older and older. So these factors could reduce potential growth rate in these economies. At this moment, Chinese economy is growing by 5%. And I personally think that the Chinese economy could grow by 4 to 5% in the next 6 years. But the general consensus is that the Chinese economic growth would slow down from 5% now toward 3.5% or so by 2030. And 3.5% growth is a very important benchmark, because according to the IMF, the world economy has grown by 3.5% in the last 20 years. Now the world economy is growing by only 3%, so that IMF argues for member countries to raise economic growth, particularly in emerging economies. But by 2030, even if the world economic growth continues to be around 3.5%, China itself is only 3.5%. That means that by 2030, the Chinese economy would lose the power to raise global economic growth. Chinese economic performance would become average of the world economy. So this is shrinking and aging population challenge. Of course, in other countries like the Philippines, Indonesia, India, and also, of course, Nepal, population is still increasing. According to the latest Nepali population statistics Nepali population is increasing by 1.5%, 1.7% annually. This is higher than in India, higher than in the Philippines, and higher than in Indonesia. One of the highest population growth in Asia. So the challenge faced by shrinking and aging population is basically East Asian challenge. On the other hand, most of Southeast Asian countries and South Asian countries, including Nepal, can continue to enjoy strong population increase as well as fairly young average age. Again, according to the Nepali statistics, I understand average age of Nepali population is 24.6 years old. Quite young, probably one of the youngest population in the entire Asia. That means that Nepal can enjoy strong population growth, particularly strong young generation population increase. This means that Nepali would have even more human resources in coming years. The third challenge is climate change, which brings about extreme weather like flood, drought, heat wave, and so on and so forth. Even in Japan, this year, we had the longest days of hot weather. Historic high or historic long days of hot weather. And as you know, in some European countries, they had more than 40 degrees centigrade temperature, which is really amazing. And of course, many countries had heavy, huge flood, including Pakistan and some Eastern European countries, and so on and so forth. So, climate change bringing about extreme weather in all over the world, I think is caused by global CO2 emissions, basically. And the Asian countries emit CO2s in large amount. For instance, in terms of million tons, Japan, 1,000, more than 1,000, Korea, South Korea, more than 600, Taiwan, close to 300, China, more than 10,000. China is the largest emitter of CO2s in the world. China is emitting close to 1/3 of the global CO2 emissions. Malaysia, more than 200, Thailand, more than 200, Indonesia, more than 500, India, of course, more than 2,500 million tons. But these are the total number of CO2 emissions. Per capita CO2 emissions show somewhat different pictures. In terms of tons, Japan emits close to 8 tons in a year. Korea, close to 11 tons. China, 7 tons. Indonesia, close to 2 tons. And India, only 1.5 ton per capita GDP CO2 emissions. And I checked the Nepali figure, whether it's correct or not, but I found that per capita CO2 emissions in Nepal is less than 1 ton or less than half a ton in a year. So Nepal is probably one of the least CO2 emission countries in the world. This is, I think, thanks to huge forest your country has, including Himalaya and so on and so forth. But anyway, Asian countries must reduce CO2s, particularly Japan, South Korea, China, those developed Asian countries. But anyway, I think since the world has committed to halve carbon by 2030 and be carbon neutral by 2050, all Asian countries are required to substantially reduce CO2 emissions in coming years. As I emphasized when I was ADB president, infrastructure investment in renewable energy, energy-efficient transport system, and energy-saving cities are crucial to mitigate climate change in Asia and in the world. Of course, by so doing, on the one hand, you may increase growth potential by introducing new technologies, new investment in those areas. But on the other hand, since these are basically cost for the society, for the economy, climate change mitigation efforts might reduce potential growth rate in the next 30 years in Asia. This is not quite certain. Maybe outcome would depend on the technologies those countries adopt and the environment of the economy. Of course, again, Nepali economy, Nepali society is in a somewhat better situation, as I said, but still, particularly big countries like China and India would be required to intensify or even redouble their effort to mitigate climate change in the next 30 years. Last but not least, big challenges faced by Asian countries is water shortage. Again, when I was ADB president, I recognized that along with climate change, water shortage was one of the most serious challenges faced by many Asian countries. Per capita water resources in terms of cubic meters are more than 3,000 in Japan, around 1,000 in South Korea, around 2,000 in China, but in Malaysia, per capita water resources in terms of cubic meters, something like 17,500 or something, which is nearly 10 times larger than in China and more than 10 times larger than in Korea. So Malaysia has huge per capita water resources. Thailand, 3,000. Indonesia also 7,000. Vietnam, nearly 4,000, Philippines 4,000, India only 1,000. Among those countries I mentioned, India is closest to water shortage. By the way, Nepal has, again, I checked the figure recently, whether it's perfectly correct or not, I don't know, but for Nepal, per capita water resources something like 6,800 cubic meters, which is close to Indonesian level, and nearly 7 times larger than in India, and more than 3 times larger than in China. Now, water shortage is more serious than climate related CO2 emissions problem, because there are many alternative sources of energy, hydraulic, fossil fuel, but also solar power, wind power, and nuclear power, and so on and so forth. So that by developing alternative sources, renewable sources of energy, countries can reduce CO2 emissions significantly. But water is singular. There's only one water. And the amount of water is limited. And nearly 80% of water is used for agriculture production all over the world. So water shortage is immediately translated into food shortage. So the water shortage is most serious in Pakistan and India. And also China is also close to water, I don't say water crisis, but water shortage state. Of course, these countries can import foods from all over the world, but world production of food is limited by the world water supply. That means that China and India may start to import. Already China has started to import a lot of foods from all over the world, particularly from the US and Brazil. India may soon start to import foods from all over the world, and that would make food prices continue to rise in the long run, worsening terms of trade for those food importing countries tremendously. On the other hand, food exporting countries like Nepal, United States, Canada, Brazil, Mexico, Indonesia, their terms of trade will continue to improve. So water shortage would have somewhat different impact on countries. But on the whole, since population is increasing, water is limited, and food supply is limited, then food prices would continue to rise in the next 30 years. So I talked about 4 challenges faced by Asian economies. Fragmentation of world economy, or East Asian geopolitical tension rising. Second is shrinking and aging population. Third is climate change. fourth is water shortage. Of course, as I said, impact on individual countries in Asia may be different from one country to another. And as I mentioned, Nepal would have strong point. Nepal is in advantageous situation in coming decades with respect to East Asian geopolitical tension rising, shrinking and aging population, climate change, water shortage. On all of those challenges, Nepal is really in a better position and in a far advantageous position compared with other Asian economies, including China and India. So my remarks may have sounded somewhat pessimistic about Asian countries, but I am sort of cautiously optimistic about Asian people's ability and determination to overcome various challenges ahead, because they have certainly overcome a lot of challenges faced by them in the last 30 years. So why not in the next 30 years? And particularly, I must emphasize that Nepal is in a much, much better position. And Nepal has huge potential to develop its economy, improve living standard, and overcoming those challenges faced by Asian economies. So I sincerely hope you, graduate students or undergraduates from Nepali universities and colleges, you will contribute to overcome these challenges and achieve peaceful and prosperous Asia, including Nepal. Thank you. Japanese economy fluctuated widely while economic growth declined toward 1 to 1.5% in the last 30 years. Of course, the asset bubble bursting in early 1990s, creating bad asset, huge bad asset among the Japanese banks that made, of course, investment sharply decline, and also inflation rate decline toward zero. But then, since the middle of 1990s, the U.S.-Japan trade friction, or some Japanese said trade war, worsened significantly, and the U.S. Targeted many competitive Japanese sectors like semiconductors, personal computers, automobiles, and even iron steel. Those rapidly increasing and very competitive sectors were almost destroyed by the U.S., if not economic sanctions, but restrictive measures on Japanese export and investment. And also, US at that time promoted weak dollar, strong yen policy, which also affected the Japanese export sector tremendously. So in the first half of 1990s, basically domestic banking crisis made recession and declining inflation rate. But in the second half of 90s, because of US-Japan trade friction created huge recession in real terms, particularly in those competitive sectors. And toward the end of the 1990s, the Japanese economy went into deflation. From 1998 through 2012, 15-year-long deflation. Average deflation, average price decline per annum was only about 0.3%. Very mild deflation, but very persistent. In 15 years, among 15 years, 11 years had negative inflation. So mild but very persistent deflation, and wages also declined, and economic growth declined, and unemployment increased. And so the worst phase was not in 1990s, but from 1998 through 2012, deflation. Then I became Bank of Japan governor, and the Bank of Japan started so-called quantitative and qualitative monetary easing, introducing very expansionary monetary policy. And the economy responded positively. Deflation was overcome, and the positive inflation rate maybe only about 1%. But new jobs were created, more than 4 million. Unemployment rate was reduced from 5% to 2.5%. 2.5% unemployment rate is, even in Japan, is more than full employment. And corporate profit has doubled. At this moment, Japanese corporate sector enjoys historic high level of profit, higher than during the bubble period in late 1980s. And finally, wages are rising, and so I hope 2% inflation target would be met in a sustainable and stable manner, at least from next fiscal year. But anyway, at this moment, the inflation rate is 3% in Japan, almost wholly caused by import price hike. And import price has been declining. So inflation rate may slow down toward 2% or even less than 2% before the end of fiscal 2023. That means that March 2024. But next year wage increase might be again 3 to 4%. Then of course 2% inflation target may be achieved sustainable and stable manner. But anyway, in the last 30 years, Japanese economy has been faced with a number of economic shocks, challenges, and it took so many years to overcome deflation and so on and so forth. Second, I do not think the world economy is faced with another global recession. Four largest economies, US, European Union, China, and Japan. US economy is relatively good shape. Inflation rate, which was at one stage reached 8%, is now 3% plus, and IMF economists predict that the inflation rate could slow down toward 2% before the end of next year, without causing any sort of recession. US economy is likely to grow by 1 to 2% this year, next year. So it's in a perfect condition. The more difficult condition, the more difficult situation is Europe. As you know, Europe had double-digit inflation last year, and European Central Bank tightened monetary policy, and it continued tightening. And the largest economy in the European Union, Germany, is likely to experience negative growth this year. And yet, inflation rate is still quite high. I can't remember exact figure of 7–8%. But last year, in some members of the European or Eurozone, Baltic countries had 20%, more than 20% inflation, because they were so much dependent on fossil fuel from Russia. That was cut, and inflation rate reached 20%. Even Germany, inflation rate reached 8% or something, and so they are determined to continue to tighten monetary policy to achieve 2% inflation target. But IMF predicts that 2% inflation would not be met this year, next year, and even in 2025, it's not 100% certain. So the European economy is likely to be faced with potential recession without 2% price stability target being met. So in a quite difficult situation. The Japanese economy has been enjoying relatively good economic growth, slightly more than 1% growth last year, this year, as well as next year. Since Japan's potential growth rate is 1%, or slightly less than 1%, for 3 years, higher than potential growth rate is likely to be achieved, meaning labor market continue to be tightened, and the corporate sector could enjoy high level of profit. And so, economy is concerned, I think it would not contribute to any global recession. China is a bit uncertain. I'm relatively optimistic about China, as I told you in the first session. But it's very difficult to exactly assess the Chinese economic growth this year, next year, and so on and so forth. IMF World Economic Outlook update in July predicted 5.1% growth for China this year. But I understand ADB recently published economic forecast for China, predicting 4.9% growth this year. And market economists are saying that, far less than 5% growth this year, and Chinese economy will continue to slow down in coming years. As I said, I'm not so pessimistic, but problem is it's difficult to exactly and correctly assess the economic conditions in China and future prospects. Maybe I would talk about a little bit about currency depreciation since Japanese yen has depreciated substantially. When I was Bank of Japan governor, yen it fluctuated slightly around 120 yen to the dollar. And when Russia invaded Ukraine on February last year, yen started to depreciate from 150 yen to the dollar toward 115 yen, 115 yen to the dollar to 150, 150 yen to the dollar in September. This was the largest depreciation Japan experienced in the last maybe 20 years or something like that. So rapid and so big depreciation that the government intervened in the exchange market and successfully recovering the yen toward 135 yen to the dollar. But since then, again, yen depreciated against the dollar. Current level is something like 147 or 80 yen to the dollar. So government may again intervene. Depreciation is in some sense good for export and good for economic recovery. But on the other hand, it's not good for the level of living standard. If you import like Nepal, depreciation would reduce living standard, consumers' basket. So I think always the government as well as the central bank must be aware of the pros and cons of currency depreciation. It all depends on the current economic financial conditions, and also depends on whether you have enough foreign exchange reserves. Japan has huge, almost amazingly large foreign exchange reserves. Currently, I think more than $1 trillion. When I was Vice Minister of Finance for International Affairs, Japan had only $2,000 or $3,000, less than half $1 trillion foreign exchange reserves. But now they have more than $1 trillion. By the way, in terms of the number of import and in terms of in relation with the GDP, Japan has more than Chinese foreign exchange reserves. China has $3 trillion, but Chinese economy is now more than 3 times bigger than Japan. So foreign exchange market intervention, foreign exchange policy, in Japan it is outside of the Bank of Japan. It is under the Ministry of Finance responsibility. But of course, exchange rate movement affect the economy and prices significantly. So all central banks must carefully watch exchange rate movement almost every day. I do think that Asian economies can continue develop in coming decades. From my experience at the ADB, I found that irrespective of political conditions, political situation, some are one-party dominated political system, some are under military government, some are under democracy, or what American political scientists say that only election democracy. Without rule of law, without freedom of speech, and so on and so forth. Despite various political systems, conditions prevailing in those Asian countries, one strong point of Asian countries is government's work. I mean, some government may be less efficient, some government may be corrupt, and so on and so forth. But I visited many African countries. I also talked with African Development Bank president in the last 20, 30 years. And the problem in Africa is government generally doesn't work. So assistance by bilateral aid agencies, assistance by African Development Bank and the World Bank in Africa tend to provide goods and services directly to the place. I mean, for schools provide textbooks, for hospitals providing medicines and so on and so forth, without much consulting with government. Governments are corrupt, governments are inefficient, governments are not working. So aid agencies, multilateral, other bilateral, tend to provide assistance directly to those institutions without making government be the major player of those economic development assistance and so on. But in Asia, completely different. ADB, as well as, of course, aid agencies like JICA, they provide money to the government with some conditions, of course. And, of course, carefully watch how the money was used for improving infrastructure or used for improving education, medical care, and so on and so forth. But at least the money would be given to the government, and the government use those monies. So Asia is, in that sense, completely different from Africa. And African countries continue to face with difficult challenges, largely political, social, because most of them have huge natural resources, but natural resources tend to cause natural resource costs rather than benefit. But in Asia, underdeveloped or developed or well-developed with various political situation, but I think generally speaking, governments work, and in the last 30 years or so, irrespective of political situation, most of Asian countries developed their economies and the living standard increased, and this will continue to be the case in Asia. Latin American countries I visited, Argentina, Mexico, Brazil, even Peru, Uruguay, and so on and so forth. Most of them are middle-income countries, but with huge natural resources, but they have not yet overcome middle-income trap. But in Asia, many countries have overcome middle-income trap and became high-income countries like China and Malaysia, and other countries would follow. So I'm relatively optimistic about Asian economic development, although there are some challenges, as I described before. Nepal, I think, as I said, Nepal has various distinctive advantages for economic development, and the most important is, of course, human resources. As mentioned, of course, water resources and good environment are advantage of Nepal, but the most important advantage is human resources. Nepal has slightly more than 30 million. And of course, between China and India, two giants, compared with two giants, Nepal appears to be a small country. But if located in Europe, Nepal larger than most of European countries, larger than Switzerland, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, Norway, comparable to the Netherlands and Belgium. So it's a big country, but between two giants. And so is big in terms of human resources. And this is the strongest part of Nepal for developing economies in coming years. So I'm quite certain that Nepali human resources should be and could be utilized maximally in coming decades. And in this sense, as I mentioned, young generation, young Nepali people could really contribute to economic development of Nepal in coming decades. And of course, maybe Nepali government people are afraid of young people going abroad and so on and so forth. But I think those young Nepali people going abroad, maybe US, Europe, or Japan, or some Asian countries, may acquire skills and technology, and they may come back to Nepal to start new companies, new institutions, so that they can contribute to the Nepali economic development. So anyway, remaining in Nepal or going abroad, I think Nepali youth could contribute greatly to economic development in Nepal. Just before coming to Kathmandu, I met two Nepali graduate students at the GRIPS, or Graduate Institute for Policy Studies. Both of them are government officials studying water resource management and so on and so forth at the Tsukuba University as well as the GRIPS. Both of them are PhD course, and they would, after acquiring a PhD, they would come back to Nepal to contribute to better water resource management and so on and so forth. So I think of course you should, the government should improve further university or graduate school education, and also startups should be supported by various measures. But I don't think you should not be so much concerned about so-called brain drain or young people going abroad, because as India and China have shown, those young people acquiring skills and also money may come back to the original countries. So, but anyway, I think contribution by young people would be really. I think, as I said, I'm optimistic about Nepali youth to contribute to economic and social development in Nepal. In this connection, as Dr. Rohani mentioned, I think Nepal is a landlocked country. The typical manufacturing sector is difficult to develop. I mean, but IT or AI or those high-tech industries, particularly IT or ITS services, can be exported quite easily, even from a landlocked country like Nepal. So I think this is an area where Nepal can be a strong exporter of IT goods or AI goods and AI services to all over the world. And I think one of the strengths of Nepali young is, they can speak English very fluently. You see, the IT or ITS language are basically English, and fluent English speaking capability is almost key for these economic development. So I am hopeful that Nepali youth could IT or AI skills and could start those companies and institutions and export those goods and services to all. Environment matter is, I think, Rohani is a famous scientist, and when I was president of the ADB, I asked him as vice president to be in charge of environmental matters and also what we called knowledge matters. And I think in one sense, Nepal is quite fortunate in having good environment. And as I said, CO2 emissions is low, and if CO2 infusion or reduction by forests is counted, Nepal is making negative CO2 emissions, and this should be recognized, I think. So Nepal is very good, well situated here, and I think environmental issues, environmental policies should be, of course, well understood and well developed in this country, and also even that sort of environmental policy could be transferred to other countries, including India. I'm not criticizing India.
Thank you very much. And the final question, which will take only 30 seconds. I know we've exceeded time, but still interesting. So far as I know, Mr. Kurara is the only person who has been the president of the Asian Development Bank, a development bank, and then become the Governor Bank of Japan, which is one of the largest economies of the world. The question is, Mr. President, Mr. Governor, and Mr. Professor Kurara, which one is more challenging to you?
Yeah, of course, ADB is a central bank, and the Japanese economy is the third largest economy in the world. So that the Bank of Japan could have a major impact on the Japanese economy and the Japanese inflation, and through Japan, even the world growth and world inflation. So certainly, Bank of Japan is quite important and powerful institution affecting Japanese economy as well as the Asian economy, world economy. On the other hand, ADB is certainly the largest multilateral development bank operating in Asia. The World Bank is, of course, the largest, but World Bank operates not only in Asia, but also Africa, Middle East, Latin America, and so on and so forth. So as far as Asia is concerned, ADB is much larger than the World Bank, and covering 48 regional countries, in financial assistance, technical assistance to around 30 emerging economies. And in that sense, quite important institution. But for large economies like India, China, or Indonesia, ADB's assistance in terms of amount of money is small. I mean, for India or China, ADB's annual disbursement could be only 3% or 4% of their total public works expenditures. So quite small. So maybe the impact of the ADB on the entire Asian developing economies may be not so large, at least not so large as the Bank of Japan. But on the other hand, after experiencing more than 10 years of central banking is not so exciting. On the other hand, the president of ADB for 8 years, I think it was much more exciting visiting all emerging economies or developing economies in Asia, discussing with government officials about problems, projects and programs, and even about the general economic and price conditions. And I met quite a few, not only development or finance ministers, but also political leaders like president and prime ministers. I think I met Indian Prime Minister Manmohan Singh maybe 7, 8 times, and I met Chinese Premier Wen Jiabo 5 times, and the Indonesian President Yudhoyono maybe again 6, 7 times, and almost all countries' political leaders I met and discussed about the economic, social, political situations, and I could feel the personalities of those leaders as well. So, in that sense, I think I always told former ADB colleagues that ADB president is much more exciting than Bank of Japan governor.